Hello everyone! Today, I'd like to go over a budget commander deck that I've built around Rosie Cotton of Southlane, a mono-white commander from The Lord of the Rings, Tales of Middle-earth. As usual, I've kept this deck under $45 using prices listed by Scryfall at the time of recording, including basic lands at 10 cents each, but not including the cost of shipping. And as always, the link to the deck list is in the description down below. Now let's get into this deck. So, Rosie Cotton of Southlane is a 1/1 halfling peasant for 1 white and 2 generic mana, who creates a food token upon entering the battlefield, and whenever you make a token, you put a +1/+1 counter on a target creature you control other than Rosie. So yeah, Rosie's far from the scariest commander out there, but that also makes it unlikely that the table that you're at will deem you the threat early on. And that might give you enough breathing room to grow a fairly wide army of buff creature tokens. Which leads us to the goals of this deck. As alluded to earlier, our main goal with this deck is to make a bunch of tokens once we have Rosie on the board. And while Mono White has some artifact token generation with food and a bit of treasure, it can be really good for making creature tokens. So this deck was built to make a large number of creature tokens that you can buff when they enter the battlefield from Rosie, and a large portion of these tokens have flying, which will provide a good amount of evasion. There's also a bunch of non-flying creature tokens, of which you can decide if you want to buff each creature token with Rosie as they enter the battlefield, or if you want to focus your +1/+1 counters on your evasive flying creatures and leave your grounded troops unbuffed. Since we'll be making a really wide board, we'll want to make use of spells that can buff a large portion of our board at once. And since we'll be making a bunch of +1/+1 counters with these tokens, we can make use of some of Mono White's Proliferate effects, though the list of cards available is unfortunately quite short, to make our buffed creatures even stronger. However, we can also make use of Anthems and similar effects to buff a large portion of our board at once. So let's move into the 99 of this deck with Mana Acceleration. First up are Goldmere and Marble Diamond, both tapping for white mana. Then there's Wayfarer's Bauble, which lets you tutor a basic land directly onto the battlefield tapped. We also have Felwar Stone, which in a 4-player game will likely tap for white mana, but if not, it can act as a generic mana source. There's also Ornithopter of Paradise, a mana dork that taps for any color, but as a flyer, it may occasionally make for an unconventional but not unreasonable target for some of Rosie's +1/+1 counters. And finally, we have some generic mana generation with Mannequin, Mind Stone, Liquimetal Torque, and Fractured Power Stone. Now I've put a few low-to-the-ground flying creatures into this deck, as Rosie requires another creature to be on the field to give her +1/+1 counters to, and she makes a food token when she enters the battlefield. These creatures also have an additional keyword, making them good options to buff when you make a non-creature token, or if you want to stack counters only on your evasive creatures. And these creatures are Segovian Angel and Swooping Lookout, both with flying and vigilance, and Healer's Hawk with flying and lifelink, and Battlefield Raptor with flying and first strike. All 4 of these creatures costing 1 white mana to cast. That being said, let's move on to the bulk of this deck with token generators. First up are a few non-creature token generators with Monologue Tax and Goldvein Pick. Monologue Tax is an enchantment that produces a treasure token for you whenever an opponent casts their second spell each turn, which can give you a lot of additional +1/+1 counters and mana to work with throughout the game. And Goldvein Pick is an equipment that gives its equipped creature +1/+1 and makes a treasure token whenever its equipped creature deals combat damage to a player, which can be put onto one of our flyers to get a higher chance of it getting through. Next up, we have some ways of generating non-flying creatures, which includes Murder Investigation, an aura that enchants a creature you control and has you make a number of 1/1 white soldier creature tokens equal to the enchanted creature's power when said creature dies. Then Call the Copper Coats has us choose any number of opponents, which changes how much mana we spend to cast a spell, and make X 1/1 white human soldier creature tokens, where X is the number of creatures those opponents control. Then we have 2 X spells with White Sun Zenith and Secure the Wastes. White Sun Zenith produces X 2/2 white cat creature tokens, and then White Sun Zenith gets shuffled into your library, and Secure the Waste makes X 1/1 white warrior creature tokens. We also have Rabble Rousing, which has Hideaway 5, letting you look at the top 5 cards of your library, which you exile 1 face down, then put the rest onto the bottom of your library in a random order. Then, when you attack with 1 or more creatures, you make that many 1/1 white-green citizen creature tokens, and if you control 10 or more creatures, you can cast the card you exiled earlier without paying its mana cost. This card can make your board go really wide within a turn or two. And then there's Finale of Glory, an X mana cost spell that makes X 2/2 white soldier creature tokens with vigilance, but if X is 10 or more, so 12 or more mana spent on the spell in total. You also make X 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance. Now we can move on to the spells that will predominantly make us flying creature tokens. This includes Midnight Haunting, an instant that makes 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. Path of the Ghost Hunter, which is an X mana cost spell that makes X 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. Clarion Spirit, which makes a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying whenever you cast your second spell each turn. Haunted Library makes a 1/1 white spirit creature token if you pay 1 generic mana whenever an opponent's creature dies. And Priest of the Blessed Graph makes X 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying at the beginning of your end step, where X is the number of opponents with more lands than you, kinda giving a silver lining to missing a land drop or falling slightly behind with lands. Field of Souls makes a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying whenever a non-token creature is put into your graveyard from the battlefield. And Twilight Drover gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature token leaves the battlefield, which you can then pay 2 generic and a white to remove a +1/+1 counter from Twilight Drover to make 2 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying. This can provide a little bit of tempo, as Rosie can help you replace one of those +1/+1 counters you removed to make the tokens, and you will get another +1/+1 counter to put on something else, along with the other +1/+1 counters that Twilight Drover will naturally get as you swing and block with your creature tokens. Not every token we make will be a spirit though, as we also have Falconer Adept, which makes a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying that's tapped and attacking whenever Falconer Adept attacks. Emeria Angel itself has flying, and can be a good target for the additional +1/+1 counters Rosie will make, and it makes a 1/1 white bird creature token with flying whenever a land enters the battlefield under your control. Zerium, Golden Wind, is a griffin with flying, and makes a 2/2 white griffin creature token with flying whenever a griffin you control deals combat damage to a player. Then we have Moonsilver Spear, an equipment that grants first strike, but also when its equipped creature attacks, you make a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying. Court of Grace makes you the monarch when it enters the battlefield, but at minimum, at the beginning of your upkeep, this card makes a 1/1 white spirit creature token with flying. But if you're still the monarch on your upkeep, you make a 4/4 white angel creature token with flying instead. Starnheim Unleashed has you make a 4/4 white angel warrior creature token with flying and vigilance, but it can be foretold, turning it into an X mana spell that can make many of those angel warrior tokens. Unfortunately, this is also the only foretell card in this deck, so people may start being able to predict what this card is if you play against them enough with this deck, but it's still a pretty powerful card in this deck nonetheless. And finally, I've put Nesting Dovehawk here, a 2/2 flyer that, while it doesn't produce a creature token on its own, it does have you populate at the start of your combat phase, which lets you make a copy of a creature token you already have on the board. However, Nesting Dovehawk itself can get huge as it gets a +1/+1 counter whenever a creature token enters the battlefield under your control, and if you choose, you can put the +1/+1 counter that Rosie will produce from the token you made from populating onto Nesting Dovehawk to make its stats balloon even faster. Now that we have the spells needed to make a wide board of tokens with a bunch of +1/+1 counters spread amongst them, we can look at the spells that will let us buff a large portion of our board at once. We can start with Unbounded Potential, Martyr for the Cause, and Grateful Apparition, all of which give us access to Proliferate, which as a quick reminder has you choose any number of permanents and or players, and give each an additional counter of each kind that is already there. So for this deck, it will be our +1/+1 counters. Unbounded Potential has you choose between proliferating and putting a +1/+1 counter on up to 2 target creatures, but if you pay the additional Entwine cost, you can choose both effects. Martyr for the Cause has you proliferate when it dies, and Grateful Apparition has you proliferate when it deals combat damage to a player. As it also has flying, it could be a good target for some of the extra Rosie Cotton +1/+1 counters. However, we don't have to stick with Proliferate to buff most of our army at once, as we also have cards like Now for Wrath, Now for Ruin, which puts a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control, gives them vigilance for the turn, and has The Ring Tempts You. This is the only card with the Ring Tempts You mechanic in this deck, so very quick, you'll choose a creature to be your ring bearer, and they will become a legendary creature, if they aren't already, that can't be blocked by creatures with greater power than them. So in general, you'll want to choose a low power creature with a higher toughness than its power to be your ring bearer, as they'll be hard to block and kill. As an example in this deck, you'd want to choose something like an unbuffed Swooping Lookout, as it's a 1/2 creature. Divine Sacrament gives weight creatures +1/+1, or +2/+2 if you have 7 or more cards in your graveyard. And aside from mana dorks, nearly all of our creatures and creature tokens have white in their color identity. Felidar Retreat is an enchantment with landfall, having you choose to either make a 2/2 white cat beast creature token, or you can put a +1/+1 counter on each creature you control and give them vigilance until the end of the turn whenever a land ETBs under your control. Both effects are good in this deck, though I'd imagine most of the time you'll be choosing the latter option. Phantom General gives our creature tokens +1/+1, and similarly, Intangible Value is an enchantment that gives our creature tokens +1/+1 and vigilance. Prava of the Steel Legion gives our creature tokens +1/+4 so long as it's our turn, and gives some access to some rather expensive creature token generation. Then there's Brave the Sands, which gives our creatures vigilance and the ability to block an additional creature. Similarly, Sen's Tactician lets creatures we control with +1/+1 counters on them block an additional creature, and can be tapped with 1 white mana to put a +1/+1 counter on a soldier creature. Also good to note, Sen's Tactician only cares that there's at least one +1/+1 counter on a creature, so the effect will still work if you have multiple +1/+1 counters on a creature. And finally, we have Sigarda's Summons, which will turn all of our creatures with +1/+1 counters on them into angels with flying and 4/4 base power and toughness. Now let's move on to the spells that we can use to protect ourselves and interact with our opponent's boards. First up, we have Holy Day, a fog type effect in white that prevents all combat damage that would be dealt this turn, a good way to avoid taking lethal damage, and Mother of Runes, a creature that can be tapped to give a creature you control protection from a color of your choosing for the turn. For interaction, we can start with Disenchant, which lets you destroy an artifact or enchantment. Then there's Darksteel Mutation, which frankly can be a really mean card in the Commander format, as it has you enchant a creature, which then turns into a 0/1 insect artifact creature with Indestructible, while losing all of its other abilities, card types, and creature types. And there's nothing that says that this card can't be applied to a commander. So unless your opponent's running a bunch of disenchants and ways of exiling their own commander, this card could be used to basically get rid of someone's commander for most of, if not the entire game. Then we have the classic Swords to Plowshares, letting you exile a target creature, but its controller gains life equal to that creature's power. Lay Down Arms is similar to Swords to Plowshares, except you can only exile creatures with mana values less than the number of planes that you control, though we're in mono white so planes should be plentiful. The exiled creature's controller also only gets a flat 3 life. Shire Sheriff lets you exile a target creature until Shire Sheriff leaves the battlefield, provided you sacrifice a token as it enters the battlefield, and you'll likely have at least one extra food token lying around from when you were casting Rosie. Then finally we have a couple of board wipes with Austere Command and the Battle of Bywater. Austere Command has you choose 2 of 4 options: destroying all artifacts, destroying all enchantments, destroying all creatures with mana value 3 or less, or destroying all creatures with mana value 4 or more. The Battle of Bywater destroys all creatures with power 3 or greater, and then you make a food token for each creature you control that remain. Given most of our creature tokens are base 1/1s and will generally only get a single +1/+1 counter from Rosie, this card is fairly close to a one-sided board wipe with how this deck is generally wanting to play. And since Rosie is very unlikely to be a casualty in this board wipe, those food tokens that you produce afterwards can be used to buff our remaining creatures well beyond their 3 power once all the dust is settled. Now let's move on to the spells that will give us some card advantage, either through draw or manipulating the top of our libraries. First up is Crystal Ball, which lets you scry 2 when tapped with 1 generic mana. It's not card draw, but it lets you manipulate the top of your library. We also have Horn of the Mark, which lets you look at the top 5 cards of your library when you attack with 2 or more creatures. You can reveal a creature card from among them, put it into your hand, and then put the rest of the cards on the bottom of your library in a random order. Then we have Arcane Encyclopedia, an artifact that lets you draw when tapped with 3 mana. Mentor of the Meek lets you draw if you pay 1 generic mana when a creature with power 2 or less enters the battlefield under your control. Note that this would include most of our creature tokens. Rumor Gatherer lets you scry 1 whenever another creature enters the battlefield under your control, and then you draw if this effect has resolved twice in 1 turn. Note that this includes creature tokens entering the battlefield, and after you've drawn, subsequent creatures entering the battlefield still will have you scry. So for example, 4 creatures entering the battlefield would trigger a scry, draw, scry, scry. Idol of Oblivion can be tapped to draw a card, but only if you've made a token that turn. Not a super hard hurdle to get over in this deck though. Endless Atlas lets you draw when you tap it with 2 mana, but it requires for you to control 3 or more lands with the same name. However, as I'll talk about later, we have a really large number of basic planes in this deck, which should easily meet this requirement. Then finally we have Mind's Eye, which lets you draw a card if you pay 1 mana when an opponent draws a card. which at minimum can happen after each opponent's upkeeps, provided you have the mana left over to spend on it. Now that we've gotten through all the spells in our deck, let's quickly move through our land base. And because I'm not satisfied with the amount of draw we have in this deck, we can start with Bonder's Enclave and Minas Tirith, 2 utility lands that can give us access to more card draw. Bonder's Enclave can be tapped with 3 mana to let you draw a card, provided you control a creature with power 4 or greater. None of our creatures start with that, but as we'll be handing out a bunch of +1/+1 counters throughout the game, if we know this is a land we will have around, we can divvy our counters in such a way to ensure that we meet this requirement. Minas Tirith lets you draw a card when tapped with 1 white and 1 generic mana, provided you've attacked with 2 or more creatures that turn, so it has to be activated after your combat phase, but we will also frequently be attacking with at least 2 creatures, so this is another fairly easy hurdle for us to get over. Now we have a few more utility lands with Karn's Bastion, which lets you proliferate, Rogue's Passage, which can let a creature be unblockable this turn, and Myriad Landscape, which can be sacrificed to let you search your library for 2 basic land cards sharing the same type, which enter the battlefield tapped. Finally, we have Secluded Steppe, a cycling land, the Fair Basilica, which can be sacrificed to let you draw a card, and 28 basic planes to round out the deck. Now let's quickly look over that price. And as you can see, this deck is currently sitting around $42.50 as of recording. As always, that includes the cost of basic lands at 10 cents a piece. Now let's quickly go over some pricier upgrades that you may want to consider. First up is Andril, Flame of the West, which is an equipment that will make 2 tapped 1/1 white spirit creature tokens with flying when its equipped creature attacks. Then there's Master of Ceremonies, which has a bunch of text basically meaning that you and your opponents each choose a token type, treasure, 1/1 citizen creature token, or clue token, which both of you will make. A good way to get a bunch of tokens even if you don't get to choose exactly what type you get. Then there's Divine Visitation, which will make subsequent creature tokens all enter the battlefield as 4/4 white angel creature tokens with flying and vigilance. And finally, there's Damning Verdict, likely the best board wipe you could ask for in this deck as it destroys all creatures with no counters on them. And frankly, I'm rather annoyed that this card costs as much as it does now, as like 4 months or so ago, this card was less than $2. Regardless, if you'd like to build, upgrade, adapt, or play this deck, the link as always is in the description down below. If you liked the video, consider giving it a like. And if you'd like more budget commander decks, consider subscribing. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you next time.